you choose is probably fine. Just sort of clear and obvious, right? Like nicely spaced out, clear fonts, all those kinds of things. But don't pad your CV. Okay, don't put in like the presentation that you gave to your second year, astronomy class as like a talk that you gave. It's not going to work in your favor in terms of padding your CV. Given the stages that most people are at in their careers when they're coming into applying to academic positions, there's not a huge expectation that you should have a 12-page CV. In fact, there's an argument to be made that 12-page CV, depending on your background, can work against you because it could be extremely intimidating, right? So having a CV that shows academic and community involvement is really, really important. Having a CV that starts to look like you're just throwing stuff in so your CV is longer starts to discredit you. So it's best to be as straight up on the CV as you can be. If you've given academic conference papers, by all means, put them all on. Of course, any publications that you've done, put them on. Also important to say, if you were, the grad student rep in your department, that's great because that shows that you're willing to do community-based work, right? Which academic departments function on people who will do that work. It also means that when you get hired, you'll be put on the hardest committees. But be that as it may, it's important to show those kinds of things. And if you've done, depending on the job that you're looking for, outside work experience can also be useful. So, if you're coming into applying for a job that has more international development, let's say you worked at an immigration clinic or something. Well, even if you weren't doing lawyering work at that clinic, if you were doing sort of community support work, that's still helpful and it's still relevant experience and it still says something about who you are. So I wouldn't hide those kinds of things on a job application. But of course, what they're primarily looking at is your degree, that you got your degree or you're close to getting it, what school you got it from, who your supervisor was, and how many publications you have. And those are really the main things that are going to come out of a CV. And the rest is like, okay, that's good, but what's really going to make a CV stand out, in all honesty, is those publications. And if you can have one or two by the time you're done, that's pretty good. People get hired without publications. It's not at all unheard of, but having publications does make it easier. Likewise, having gotten a Trudeau or a Shirk also puts you in good stead. There's not a lot of fairness underlying that because it is a bit capricious the ways in which people get those scholarships, but unfortunately, again, it's not a perfect process. For your written submission, something that you've published is best. If you don't have anything published, then submit the most polished chapter of your thesis you can. Don't submit a course paper. Don't submit a comp or an exam. It needs to be like polished original research. So make sure your committee's gone over it. Make sure it's really tight. On the committees that I've served on, we've read lots of dissertation chapters, and that's totally fine. But it needs to be really, really clean. For the teaching part, if you have taught and you have outlines, it would be great to include one or two of those. But don't include your student evaluations because they don't care. So I'm sorry, it's true. You can say in your teaching statement, that you've received good evaluations from students, but don't put those in. Okay, and then you have to write usually a teaching statement and a research statement. And to a certain extent, some members of hiring committees take these things awfully seriously. Some see them as just sort of managerial techniques that dean's offices put into job applications that don't really mean much of anything. I take them seriously. I read them seriously. I want to know that the person that we're looking to interview has thought about teaching, has thought about pedagogical issues. In our program, because we tend to be a more kind of lefty, social justice-y kind of, we're not explicitly that, and there are people in my program who would cringe at the thought, but by and large, that is generally who we are, and generally the people that we hire tend to bring a lot of social justice ethic into the classroom, and so seeing that people have thought about things like diversity in the classroom would be important. In our department, it's not necessarily important in other departments, but that's just the variability. And then your research statement, which is really, really important. Because a department wants to know that you have thoughts beyond your PhD. And I know you may not have thoughts beyond your PhD right now. I certainly sometimes still feel like I didn't actually ever think past my PhD. But you have to at least pretend to have thoughts past your PhD. So some kind of fairly new project that, of course, you intend to apply to shirk for or whatever. That you hope will bring in some research dollars. A paragraph or two on that. This is not your shirk proposal. This doesn't need to be detailed. But it's also what you're doing with this is you're throwing a kind of gentle lob to the hiring committee, and it's for sure something they're going to explore with you in the interview. This is actually an interesting control strategy on the part of the candidate, because this is where you can gain some footing and say, I'd like to talk about this area, right? This is something I'm interested in, so if we have to have a conversation, let's have a conversation about this, right? And so it makes sure that for your sake, you know that at least part of the interview is going to focus on an area that you feel like you're in command of, which makes a big difference. And there are, other points through this process where you can gain a little power and feel a little empowered, and I'll flag those for you. Okay, and all of this obviously goes with a cover letter. I feel like this is grade 10 business English, but the cover letter is really, really, really important. Because it needs to show that you know enough about the department to understand why you would be a good fit there. That's where name dropping, not egregious name dropping, but just like if you actually know people in the department or would like to know people in the department or think your work overlaps with somebody's or whatever, that's where it's useful to say that, right? It's useful to say I'm committed to interdisciplinary work, or I feel really passionate about poverty law, or whatever it is, right? And then to illustrate that a little bit in your cover letter. And to a certain extent, really that cover letter follows the same rules that any cover letter for any job would follow. But it is really important to spend time on that cover letter, because some people, remember, you have a hiring committee that will vet your whole file, but the whole department has the right to view your file, and so and they will vote as a department on whether or not you get hired. And for lots of people in the department, all they'll read is your cover letter and your CV. So remember that then that cover letter is like one of the main things that represents you in terms of hiring. But don't cringe, because you can write really good cover letters. And then lastly, just prepping for that interview, all the things you need to do to get the interview is your references. Choose these very carefully. Your supervisor has to be one of them. But otherwise, don't choose the prof whose course you hated and who you challenged every 5 minutes. Or the one who, is 6 minutes away from retirement and could really care less what anybody does beyond this point. Like, choose people who you know are going to be supportive of you. It's great if you can find one or two people who are from outside of your institution, or at least outside of your department. Great if you can find somebody who's outside of your country, but that's not necessary. I mean, again, hiring committees take into account where you are at in terms of your career, and so expectations are kept very much in line with that. But if you worked on a research project with somebody, or you were an RA, or you know,